History is filled with all sorts of weird events that seem too bizarre to be real. At first glance, many of these events sound like they were made up by some guy on Reddit trying to get attention. But unlike those stories, these ones aren't made up. Events that you wouldn't believe really happened if you didn't have me to assure you that they're real. And we're going to explore the most bizarre events that have ever happened in history. Or at least the ones I think are, with my extremely limited understanding of the world and subjective, self-centered opinions. First up, the time Napoleon was defeated by an army of rabbits. Napoleon, widely regarded as one of the greatest conquerors of all time, the man who defeated almost every major power in Europe simultaneously, was bested in battle by bunnies. After defeating the Fourth Coalition and forcing the Russian and Prussian leaders to sign an unfavorable peace treaty, Napoleon decided to give himself and his closest bros a celebration. So he asked his right-hand man to arrange a rabbit hunt for him and the boys. Berthier knew that despite being one of the most powerful commanders in the world, Napoleon wasn't a very good shot. So to compensate for this, Berthier decided to gather hundreds of rabbits, with some accounts claiming up to 3,000 of them, and had them put in cages around a field to be released for a day of easy and plentiful hunting. On the day of the event, a party made of Napoleon and his most elite generals and diplomats stood by with guns and beating sticks ready to hunt the rabbits. But instead of scurrying away from the party, the rabbits bounded towards them. At first, Napoleon and his crew found the behavior to be amusing. Then the rest of the bunnies followed suit, and their amusement quickly turned into fear, as hundreds of bunnies charged directly at the Emperor of France, piling around his feet and climbing up his legs, sending him into a stagger. He tried to scare the rabbits away with his riding crop, while his men used their guns and hunting sticks to try and scare them off. Ultimately, though, Napoleon opted for a tactical retreat, making a break for his carriage as he waded through a sea of rabbits. But the rabbits were not done yet. In a twist of fate reminiscent of Napoleon's military strategy, the horde of rabbits split into two groups around the band of hunters and bolted for Napoleon's carriage. And some of them even jumped into the carriage as it drove away, forcing Napoleon to grab them and chuck the little buggers out. Only then did the emperor escape their wrath, conceding the field to the army of bunnies. It turns out the reason the bunnies acted so unexpectedly was because they were all tamed rabbits purchased from farms. If they were captured wild hares, they likely would have scurried away at the first opportunity. But instead of capturing a bunch of wild rabbits, Berthier opted for the easier method of purchasing farmed rabbits. Having not been fed before the hunt, the rabbits bounded towards the group believing they would feed them, and showed no signs of fear when they attempted to shoo them, as they were bred and raised to trust humans. Moral of the story? Even if we can't make fun of Napoleon for being short, we can make fun of him for losing a staged battle against bunnies. The Great Boston Molasses Flood. In the north end of Boston, Massachusetts, just before the 1920s, there was a big flood that did a lot of damage to a local neighborhood, as well as killing many animals and people in the process. But this wasn't a normal flood. It was a flood made of molasses. At the Purity Distilling Company in Northeast Boston, 1919, there was a large tank located nearby designed for holding molasses. Standing 15 meters tall and 27 meters wide, the tank held a total of 2.3 million gallons of molasses at the time just before the disaster. On the 15th of January, 1919, the temperature outside had risen dramatically from the previous days. On top of that, a ship had delivered a fresh load of molasses that was added to the tank, which was heated to lower its viscosity. Basically, they heated it up to make it less molasses-like. These two factors together were theorized to have caused the old colder molasses in the tank to expand and cause the accident on that day. Because sometime past noon that day, people nearby the site reported a loud roar accompanied by the ground shaking, as the rivets that held the molasses tank together were shot out of their positions while the tank collapsed. A gigantic wave of molasses rushed out onto the streets. You would assume that a flood of molasses would be easy to escape due to how thick and slow the material is. But at such a high volume and with so much weight behind it, the wave is said to have stood 8 meters high and reached speeds of up to 35 miles an hour at its peak. The flood was so powerful that nearby buildings collapsed and a truck was lifted up and washed into the harbor. Multiple horses, dogs, and people got caught up in the wave. When the wave finally settled down, it covered everything in about 2 to 3 feet of molasses. Due to the low temperature outside of only 4 degrees Celsius, the molasses hardened and made the already thick and sticky substance even harder to get out of. Many people were left stranded in the molasses, as anyone that attempted to rescue them would get stuck as well, leaving them with no choice but to wait until the temperature outside dropped enough for the molasses to be walked on. The rescue effort took about 4 days, but the full cleanup took about 2 weeks, while the smell of molasses stuck around for decades, and left a sticky texture to everything in the area. All in all, about 150 people were injured and 21 killed. The fault was largely to be blamed on the negligence of the company owner's part, using steel that wasn't thick enough and ignoring obvious warning signs of the tank's damage. People even complained that the tank was leaking molasses multiple times, so they decided to paint the tank brown to help disguise this fact, rather than actually trying to fix it. The message I get from this story is that anything good can be bad if not had in moderation. A cup or two of molasses is fine, but 2.3 million gallons of it will create a very big mess. The dancing plague of 1518. In the good old days before modern medicine, disease was able to run amok the human population a lot more freely. But instead of slowly killing you with an array of health problems like most illnesses, this disease afflicted you with uncontrollable dancing until you collapsed from exhaustion, sometimes until death. It started inside a town called Strasbourg in the Holy Roman Empire during the June of 1518, when a woman began breaking it down uncontrollably in the streets outside her home. People that walked by saw her strange behavior and decided to boogie down with her. At first it was just a handful, then dozens, and by August hundreds of people had joined her. Nobody knew what caused this reaction, including the dancers themselves. When questioned on it, they were unable to explain why they couldn't stop tearing it up. Soon enough, the dancing became so much of a problem that the authorities had to take action. The problem, though, is that they weren't sure what to do about it. So they asked the physicians what they should do, and being the qualified medieval medical professionals they were, they reasoned that the dancing must have been from hot blood, and to be cured, they had to dance themselves free of it. They ordered that the town construct a stage for the dancers, and hired musicians to play for the afflicted so that they could break it down even harder. But for some strange reason, this actually made the problem worse, causing even more people to start cutting a rug, as many feared it was a punishment from the martyr Saint Vitus, which they had to participate in to be free of sin. So they U-turned on the approach and banned dancing entirely, and even music too. Those that still danced were sent to the shrine of St. Vitus wearing a bunch of religious Christian swag to pray their condition away. By early September, the plague had abated and ended soon enough after. There are many theories as to why the whole thing happened, ranging from demonic possession to tainted wheat, but the most plausible theory is that it was a widespread case of mass hysteria. Sometimes you don't move to the rhythm, but the rhythm moves you. The cat nun outbreaks. On a note similar to the dancing plague, this is another supposed incident of mass hysteria. It's said that one day in a French convent, aka a nunnery, one of the nuns started meowing. This is bizarre behavior, sure, but what makes it so noteworthy is that instead of dying off immediately or being forced to stop by other nuns, is that some of them joined her. Then more, and more, until the entire convent was meowing alongside her, which they did for several days in unison, at a specific time of day for several hours, and it was so loud the surrounding neighborhood could hear it. Or at least this is the story we were told to believe, a story that has been retold in many accounts of mass hysteria, including by the internet icon Salmonella. Yes, I'm aware that Sam has covered this topic before, and I'm also aware of the people saying that I'm a Sam clone, because I use stickman drawings to talk about collections of topics. But did you know that Sam was WRONG?! Potentially. See, what Sam failed to mention is that the details behind this event are extremely shaky. The Meowing Nun incident was mentioned offhandedly in only 2 known texts. Once in the Epidemics of the Middle Ages by J.F.C. Hecker, and once in Solitude by George Zimmerman. And in both situations, the books only speak of the incident in less than a paragraph. And both fail to mention the exact date or location, or even the source that they got this information from. And in the first book, it isn't even the author that mentions the Meowing Nuns, but the translator Babington in a note under his writing. I, however, can provide my sources. It's from somebody else that did all the heavy lifting for me. And if Sam did a good job, he also would have mentioned the similar occurrence of the biting nun outbreak. In this instance, one of the nuns began biting her companions. It went down very similar to the Meowing Nun incident, but this trend spread not only to the entire nunnery, but to multiple nunneries all across Europe, reaching as far as throughout Germany to Holland to even Rome, and ended in a similar fashion when the authorities threatened them with beatings. So did the Meowing Nun incident actually happen? Possibly. With all the stress that nuns had to go through from being forced into a life of poverty, hard labor, and obedience, it often took quite a toll on their mental health. So I'd wager that these trends were created as outlets for their stress and having nothing better to do. But unlike the biting incident, the meowing incident could have very well been made up by Zimmerman and passed along in conversation. So take that, Sam! I just exposed you for potentially being wrong and not explaining the whole picture. I did a better job and I proved I'm superior to you. You know what? Now go sit in the corner and think about what you did. Some people. Where was I? Oh yeah, Norwegian butter smuggling. In late 2011, Norway had a crisis over a distinctive shortage of butter in the country, one which forced some people to resort to smuggling to get their hands on it. Like any economic problem, there were several factors contributing to the crisis. In 2011, Norwegians used a lot of butter in their meals, especially during holiday seasons like Christmas. Normally, the industry could accommodate for this, but the summer of 2011 was very cold and had a lot of rain, causing the grass to grow slower, and leaving less food for the cows to eat and turn into milk. The nail in the coffin that allowed this to happen was Norway's own regulation system. Norway's largest dairy product cooperative and market regulator, Tyne, which essentially had a monopoly over the country's dairy, used tariffs to protect its industry. The government made very large tariffs to prevent cheaper imported butter from undercutting farmers, enough to double their price on the shelves, effectively deterring any competitors from outside the country, so they couldn't import butter from all their nearby neighbors that had more than enough. On top of that, Tyne didn't properly communicate with the farmers about the butter shortages, so a lot of their butter ended up being exported when it could have stayed in the country for butter-desperate Norwegians. They attempted to fix this by relaxing the tariffs on butter so more could find its way into the country, but this wouldn't take effect until some time had passed, because most butter companies weren't interested in setting up supply chains for the short-time problem. All this made the price of butter in the country essentially quadruple, and sensing the opportunity, several individuals took advantage of the situation to sell butter smuggled through the border. A number of arrests were made, like a Russian man apprehended at the border with Sweden trying to smuggle 200 pounds of butter into the country. There was also multiple marketing stunts trying to take advantage of the shortage, where they tried to hook people on their services with free butter. Ultimately, though, the shortage wasn't that big of a deal, as it was only butter, and it did eventually get resolved. So maybe try eating a healthier, more varied diet next time, huh? The Straw Hat Riots. Speaking of people getting upset over inane little things, did you know there was a series of violent riots over men's fashion choices, which resulted in beatings, arrests, and even death? Back in the USA in 1922, New York City had entire mobs of people patrolling the streets with the intention of stealing people's straw hats and smashing them. This was because of an unwritten fashion rule at the time that men shouldn't wear straw hats past September 15th, and should instead switch to wearing felt hats. Men who didn't would be subjected to ridicule, and possibly even having their hat knocked off and stomped on. 2 days before this date, a group of particularly rambunctious rabble-rousers decided to LARP as the literal fashion police, and begin stealing the hats off of dock workers early. However, the workers resisted and a fight ensued, leading to several injuries and arrests. But things didn't end there. Next evening, gangs of teenagers patrolled the streets looking for straw hats to destroy, some wielding long sticks with nails at the end to hook them off people's heads. Anyone that resisted was subjected to violence. These gangs consisted of hundreds of people, with one man claiming about 1,000 in total. The violence over poor fashion got so intense that many people were hospitalized, one man lost an eye, and another was murdered, all because of out-of-season hats. It goes to show you that people attacking one another over silly things is nothing new, as people have gotten unreasonably upset over other people liking things they don't like through most of history. Pepsi becomes the world's 6th largest naval power. Pepsi, the company that became well known for selling carbonated sugar water, at one point owned a larger military than most countries on the planet. People often joke about big corporations having so much power they act like their own governments, but they rarely have actual military hardware like Pepsi did. Even stranger, this armada came into their possession from the hands of the Soviet Union, having exchanged it for their soda ingredients. In total, Pepsi ended up owning 17 submarines, 2 cruisers, a destroyer, a frigate, and a bunch of other smaller miscellaneous seacraft, technically making it have a bigger navy than all but 5 countries in the world at the time. There were a number of odd circumstances that were responsible for the deal being able to happen. The year was 1989, when the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. The country was facing a severe shortage of vodka, and was unable to get more due to the sanctions placed on it from its invasion of Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Pepsi looked on and saw opportunity. They figured they could barter their canning concentrates and syrups to the Soviets, since they could use those ingredients to make more vodka, and in return they could take their aging military equipment worth significantly more and sell it. Unfortunately for Pepsi, though, the naval armada proved expensive to maintain, and they had almost no experience in dealing with Soviet naval hardware. Worse yet, the Soviet Union collapsed soon afterward, and alongside the Soviets' influence vanished potential buyers and parts to maintain the ships with. Pepsi now had to figure out how to rid themselves of this new naval liability, so they ended up auctioning off the ships to the highest bidder, and selling them as scrap to a plethora of odds and ends buyers. When all was said and done, this hardware ended up scattered to a variety of odd and uncertain endings, in a way very reminiscent of the Soviet Union's messy collapse. Okay, that's the end of this video. Hey, if you're interested, why don't you check out some of these videos? Come on, they're right there. Click on them. Aren't you curious? Do it. Come on, do it.